Hi, everyone. Welcome to the January 8th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragonin. I'll be joined in just a second by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. It's good to get back in the swing of things with these recap shows. I know we missed a few with the holidays, Christmas and New Year's falling on the wrong days for us to tape these. So I think it's been about 3 weeks since we did a TimeformUS Pacecast. We're not going to look back at all of those races. We discussed some of the major races on last week's TimeformUS forecast from over the holiday period, but we're going to take a look back just at last weekend's races on this week's show. We're going to focus on a couple of Derby preps, one at Gulfstream, the Mucho Macho Man, as well as some other stakes races from there, as well as the Sham Stakes from Santa Anita and some other graded stakes that they ran out in Southern California this past weekend. And then we'll close out the show by moving on to Aqueduct and Fairgrounds to discuss some notable performances from those venues as well. Craig, as you could probably hear in my voice, I'm a little bit hoarse today. I've been dealing with the flu for the past few days, which is why we're recording this one day later this week. So I'll just cut to you. And how are you doing this week, Craig? And what would you make of the racing?
I'm doing fine. No flu here. Luckily, I've been down that road before, so I feel for you. I thought the racing was decent. It was a solid start to the year. I mean, it's our first real stakes action of 2020. I thought it was a really solid card at Gulfstream Park. Some good racing at Santa Anita, and then we're going to talk about a couple others. But I would start with the Mucho Macho Man. It was probably the race that caught most people's attention the most. And I thought it was a decent performance by Chancet. He won, got a nice 112 TimeformUS speed figure, and it was a really exciting race to watch. Coming down the stretch, it was him and As Seen on TV who were just knocking heads through the lane. I think As Seen on TV even stuck his head in front at one point. We didn't get the hot pace that our TimeformUS pace projector predicted. So given that, I thought it was just moderate. It wasn't like a crawl fest or anything. We had a horse on the lead kind of running off a little bit, but he didn't go really fast. So I thought even the third place finisher, Sol Volante, ran pretty well in this spot.
Yeah, I thought there were nice performances by each of the top two finishers. Chancet, obviously, we know he loves to win races. We saw that last year at Gulfstream Park, and he showed a lot of grit to get the victory this day over As Seen on TV. I did think that I was a little surprised there wasn't an inquiry into the deep stretch part of the race because Chancet did drift out a lot right before the wire. And I know they had an inquiry looking at an incident at the quarter pole that, there was nothing there. I don't know what they were looking at, but Chancet really did drift out into As Seen on TV's path right at the end of that race. Whether it made the difference or not, I'm not sure. But I thought both of these horses ran really well, as you were noting. And I agree, Sol Volante, who was third, he's a horse that I do want to see back on turf eventually because he does have that big turf pedigree and he's been so visually impressive in those turf races. But he handled the dirt just fine here, and I guess I wouldn't be shocked if they continue on the Derby trail with him.
Yeah, he might be worth another shot. I do want to point out, I think it was a trainer's objection, and I'm not sure I agree with you. I don't know what they were looking at. It clearly looked like they were looking at the wrong spot. So not sure why there wasn't a change made or at least more serious look given to it. But I'm trying to avoid. That's one of my resolutions for 2020. I'm not going to discuss stewards' decisions too much. Just leave it to their fate and move on. But solid race to begin the 3-year-old campaign in Florida. And I assume we'll see some of these next time out in the Holy Bull.
Yep, looking forward to that as these races are sure to get tougher as we move on down deeper on the Derby trail. Let's move on to another 3-year-old stakes race. This one on the turf was the Grade 3 Kittens Joy, run earlier in the card at Gulfstream Park on Saturday. And this one was really dominated towards the front end as Island Commish was just stalking the runner-up Get Smokin' for most of the way, took over at the top of the stretch, and these two just dominated to the wire in a race where nobody could really close from the back of the pack.
Yeah, I think that this is one of those weird races where we even had the paces a little bit fast at the half-mile pole compared to the final time. We have that one highlighted in red, but nobody could make up any ground. It probably had something to do with the race setup. It was 7.5 furlongs. I forget exactly where the rail was, but that is definitely something you want to monitor. The way they have just so many different setups with long run-ups, short run-ups, wide rails, no rail, just barely off, that you really got to track what's winning currently. I did mention on the forecast, you can check on the Gulfstream site where the rail is going to be and what gap they're going to use. And I think that's really a big play and a big point. And I think it had a big factor on this particular race.
Yeah, originally I was going to question you about the fact that part of this pace is color coded red because, I mean, just watching the fractions go up and the way the race was run visually, you would have expected a slow pace situation. But then I looked up the charts and saw that the run up for this race was listed as 7 feet, which is basically zero effectively. So, I mean, it's no surprise that the first quarter seems slow compared to the other race, the Ginger Brew run at the same distance, where the run up was, I think, 80 feet longer than this race. So that's a pretty big difference. And I think that accounts for the huge disparity in paces between these two races. And while this race did favor horses towards the front end, it's possible that the top two were just the two best horses. So I don't know if that the way the fractions played out really totally explains why the race was run the way it was.
Right. And they got decent figures for young 3-year-olds. The winner got a 103. The runner up got Smoking, got a 104. And you make a really good point. And when you're looking at these races at Gulfstream, you just can't use raw fractions without putting them in some context, particularly because of the run ups. When I make the figures, I use completely different baselines depending on what gaps used. And that's what determines the run up. So I have a different baseline for each rail setting and combination with the gap. And so you may see some things that look funny on the figures, but it's something I put a lot of work into and really spend time to make sure I get it right. Because frankly, in the beginning, I mean, 15 years ago when I was making these figures at Gulfstream, we didn't have all this information available and they were real head scratchers. Some of the figures would come up and just made no sense. So I've really kind of honed it down, and I actually have a lot of faith in the figures that I make now, pace and final time at Gulfstream on the turf.
No, I think that's really important to note because we can move right on to the Ginger Brew, which was run 2 races later at Gulfstream Park. And people will see that the early fractions were about 1 2/5 seconds faster at the quarter and the half mile pole. But the pace figures look basically the same as the other race. And the final time of this race was actually about 1/10 of a second faster than Island Commish ran in the Kittens Joy. But you gave it a TimeformUS speed figure that was about, I think, 8 points lower. And that's all due to the run-ups because these races were not run at the same distance. And it's just hard to make those comparisons without looking up that data. As for the winner of the Ginger Brew, she's my type. I know we talked about her a lot on the TimeformUS forecast last week. She's a filly that was really impressive in her debut at Gulfstream Park a month ago. And she just built on that effort here and did it against a better field with the same kind of performance.
She did. She increased her figure from an 87 to a 95 here. I want to give props to Tyler Gaffalione. I mean, I thought this was just a fabulous ride. Every time he had to make a decision to make, he made the right one. So as much as I like this horse going in, I would be a little leery going out. Not that she's not a talented filly, but just everything went her way. She got the perfect pace setup. She got the perfect ride. So, I'm not going to upgrade her off that effort. I think we saw what she is now because this was just about as good a trip as you're going to get. Moral Reasoning also ran well. She's another one we talked about on the forecast. She was just beating the neck, but I think the trip that Tyler gave this winner is what was the difference between the two.
And she's my type as a horse that I know has come from sort of humble beginnings. She was a pretty inexpensive yearling purchase for a sire that I think a lot of people don't know too well, a French sire. But if you look at her pedigree, she is very closely related to that good Christophe Clement horse, Black Type, who got very good as an older horse. They're by the same sire, and Black Type is actually a half-brother to this filly's Dam. So she's got a right to keep getting better with age, and definitely an exciting prospect if she can continue on this forward progression. Let's talk about a couple of the sprint stakes races from Gulfstream Park on Saturday, both at 6 furlongs on the dirt. The Limehouse was won by Chivalry, a horse who's, I think, winning his 3rd race in a row here for Ralph Nix. I thought he ran pretty well. He definitely got a good pace ahead of him. Not a horse that had shown a real affinity to pass a lot of horses in his prior races, but, I mean, he just couldn't help doing it here because they went so fast on the front end and the speed just came back to him.
Yeah, they did. And he also, I don't think, if I remember right, he's a horse that just kind of shot up the rail when the horse is tired. So he didn't lose ground making his close or anything. Just an okay race for me. He got a 98 for the win. I mean, these are 3-year-olds just like Chance It. So if you compare it to him, they're a good 14 points behind, just sprinting. So I'm not going to be too excited about this race or the Philly race we're going to talk about in a minute when they're only running 98 speed figures with a perfect setup.
And while Chivalry has really improved in his recent starts, I mean, I think it is instructive to go back at his 2-year-old season and see that Chance had beat him by 18 lengths and a dozen lengths the 2 times that they met. So, I mean, that's just flatters Chance that this horse has improved so much since they met as 2-year-olds. On the filly side of things, we saw a more visually impressive performance from the winner of the Glitter Woman, as Sound Machine really got back to her debut effort here, because I know she was a horse that won really impressively last summer at Gulfstream and had disappointed at short prices in a couple of races since then, once at Keeneland, once more at Gulfstream. But she got back to the kind of filly that I think they hoped that she would be from the start in this race, just really dominating this field in what seemed like a wide open race on paper.
Yeah, she was a horse I think we mentioned on the forecast. This was a kind of race where you wanted to find a horse you really thought was going to improve off their last. I thought she had kind of a tough trip last time out. And, she just went back to that debut, as you said. She got a nice 94, so almost as good as the Colts did. I think final time they were very similar, just a difference of how much faster the pace was in the Chivalry race. But, good effort. She won as easy as could be. So, going forward again, tough to know what to make of these. These are ungraded races. She only ran a 94, so it's not a filly I'm going to be looking for to jump onto the Oaks Trail or anything like that, but solid enough filly for me.
On Sunday at Gulfstream Park, we saw what was probably the biggest speed figure that was posted down there this weekend, as the venerable 10-year-old gelding, Pandey Price, got back to the winner's circle, coming off layoff here against allowance horses, earning a 117 TimeformUS speed figure for this 5-furlong victory. Just a cool old horse. He's probably never going to be a graded stakes type performer, but at this lower level, he's just really hard to beat.
Yeah, that's the only reason I wanted to mention it. When you got a 10-year-old that's still able to run these kind of speed figures in a 5-furlong sprint, I mean, that's just a really cool story. I think he's won 18 out of 29 races, and it's like 15 or 16 out of 21 at 5 furlongs on the turf. So just a really cool horse to follow. Interesting to me, he was entered for a tag. I mean, granted, it's a high tag of 62.5, and he is a 10-year-old, but, they were willing to lose him in this spot, but nobody bit, probably luckily for the connections, because this is a horse who just seems to be a money-making machine, and he showed he's still in really good form.
The most surprising thing to me was that he wasn't favored. They made Fig Jelly the favorite, which really shocked me, because Fig Jelly is he's got a case of seconditis, as you might say. I think he's finished second almost like 10 times in his 20 races. So he didn't want to win here either, as Pandey Price was able to get the job done. And I'm sure he'll be back into stakes company very soon, as long as they keep him in training. Let's move out to Santa Anita to discuss one more Derby prep on this show. It was the Grade 3 Sham. This is the only one that was actually offering Derby points from this past weekend. And it wasn't the most competitive field heading in, and it turned out to not be the most competitive field on the racetrack either, as Authentic broke from the gate in front, slowed the pace down, and it was really over on the backstretch, because you could see that the 2 horses that were his main rivals were just stuck in behind some long shots on it, and they couldn't really get into the clear at any point. And by the time Azul Coast and the other horse, Tyshawn, got clear running in the stretch, Authentic was just long gone.
He was. Yeah, I'm not really sure what to make of this race. Authentic, he's obviously still just, he's a bit immature. He was goofing off through the stretch, but he did everything right. I mean, he ran a good 108 TimeformUS speed figure, so he's almost up there with Chance It in just his second start compared to that much more seasoned rival. He did it easily, but, it wasn't as easily as he won. I would have thought it would have been a bigger speed figure, but they were pretty cut and dried. There wasn't any questionable things when we were making the figures for these races. It was pretty simple to do. So the 108, he'll definitely have to improve on that. But again, it's just his second start, first time around 2 turns. He was actually moving from a 5.5 furlong race to this 2-turn race. So pretty impressive. The rest, I'm not sure what to make of them, because nobody really stepped up. They didn't improve at all. They basically ran what they've been running and just got beat by a better horse.
Yeah, I don't know what to make of Authentic. As you were saying, it was a race that you kind of expected the speed figure to come back higher than it was, and then you kind of realize what was behind him, and I guess it's not a big surprise that even though he won by 8 lengths, it didn't get the biggest speed figure. I also did not love the way that he was just greenly drifting out and in through the stretch. It didn't seem like there was anything out there that really should have been bothering him. It's not like Drayden Van Dyke was going to a full-out drive on the horse. He was actually handriding him home, and he was just really green out there. That's not the type of thing you like to see. I know we talked about that with Independence Hall as well when he won the Jerome. You just don't want to see these horses not focused on running in these races. He is lightly raced, and he can get over that stuff. But, I mean, he's the kind of horse that if the going gets a little bit tougher next time, I'd be willing to take a shot against him because he really has to show that he can still overcome some adversity. If I was going to take another horse out of this race, it would probably be Azul Coast because he just was never really in a position to do a whole lot of running. He was aggressive into the first turn, but was kind of hemmed in inside with nowhere to go. And Joel Rosario just sort of gave him an education, taking dirt down on the inside. And he did have a little bit of run in the stretch. He didn't go anywhere really or make up any ground on Authentic. But I thought he kind of just couldn't get into the race at a critical point on the far turn in a race that did feature a relatively slow pace. So maybe he deserves another shot. But I think all of these horses have to run a little bit faster in the future to be considered serious Derby contenders.
Yeah, this is a race we don't have coded as slow pace, but it was pretty close to it. It's just below the cutoff. So Authentic definitely had things his own way. One thing I wanted to ask you, we hear a lot about horses like him and Independence Hall. People give them excuses. They are lately raced horses, but my opinion is generally these horses don't lose these habits. It's pretty hard to train out of them. And, it's not something I'm just going to assume that's going to get fixed next time out and things are going to go well. And I'm curious how you look at things like that.
I often look at the trainer. If it's Shug McGahee, who doesn't really always have his horses cranked up to win first time out and they do something goofy, you might say, oh, Shug takes his time. He'll figure the horse out. He'll be best as a 4-year-old. But with Bob Baffert, they come out firing. And when a Bob Baffert horse is showing real greenness early on, it's typically not a great sign. It's the same thing with the Chad Brown horse. These horses are typically finished products by the time they finally make their debuts. So it's really not a great sign that they're still showing those immaturity issues, deeper into their racing careers. I know it's just his second career start, but he's already, pointing towards the Kentucky Derby. So there's not a whole lot of time to work out these kinks. With Independence Hall, I don't really know Mike Trombetta's MO that well. I mean, he's not, he doesn't have the best first time out stats. He can develop a horse over time, so we'll see what happens with him. But I do often look at the trainer's pattern and see, is this horse kind of bucking the trend, or is this something that the trainer does often where they can, figure out if this horse is going to be better as an older horse and can get over these issues. Speaking of Bob Baffert and him getting young horses ready, he had the 3 top choices in the Santa Ynez on Sunday, and it was the most experienced of the 3, the one that I know that we preferred the least on the TimeformUS forecast when we were talking about this race last week. But Bast, her experience just came through, and at the end of the day, I think she just got the 7 furlongs more than the other 2 who just got a bit leg weary at the end of this race.
Yeah, and I would give those 2 a bit of an excuse. The pace was pretty hot. We have both the quarter mile and the half mile coded in red. And Bass drew outside. She got the perfect trip. But, she's turning into a really professional 3-year-old filly. She increased her speed figure again to a 110. Again, there were plenty of dirt races on the card. It was no problem making this figure. No real question marks, or head-scratching data points there. So I'm happy with the 110. And I thought it was a solid race. So Auberge, who ran second, backed up her 111, which I had been a little shaky on. The horses out of that race hadn't run particularly well, but drawing the inside, facing pressure, and she didn't break the greatest. I kind of talked about that on the forecast that I didn't really like that rail draw for a horse second start out. That's a speed horse, but I thought she ran great and actually got a point better speed figure, as I said, matching that 111. And even Golden Principle ran okay. So I think this is a strong race. It was a grade 2, but it wouldn't surprise me if these fillies keep on the Oaks Trail and make some noise.
Yeah, I agree with that. I was not really disappointed in Auberge and Golden Principle. They ran, I think, about as well as you could have expected. Golden Principle looked to be traveling really well coming to the top of the stretch and briefly appeared as if she might have both of her stablemates measured, but she just got a little bit leg weary at the end of the race. Bast, turnbacks like Bast are always going to be dangerous because they've got the bottom and the foundation to go these longer sprint distances, having already achieved the route success. So, she definitely had the advantage on this day, and she did run the best speed figure of her career. So, it's nice to at least see that Bast is still improving this deep into her career. And if she continues to progress, she can be the kind of horse that might be a Kentucky Oaks contender remains to be seen, but it is nice to see that she's still taking steps forward because she is a pretty accomplished horse already at this time for an early season 3-year-old filly.
Yeah, you don't often see horses. Oh, sorry about that. I was going to say, you don't often see fillies with 3 grade 1s, and now I think this was a grade 2 on their resume this early in their career.
Yeah, no, I mean, she had a legitimate claim to be an Eclipse finalist because she did win those 3 grade 1 races last year, just not the most important of the ones that she attempted. Moving on to the grade 2 San Gabriel, which they ran on Saturday at Santa Anita. This was the one turf stakes they ran last week in Southern California. And we talked about it on the forecast last week. Not the strongest race for a grade 2 event, but Desert Stone, who won this race, he is pretty good when he's in form. He's just a little bit unpredictable at times, but coming off the layoff, Richard Baltas had him ready to go. And I thought that Giovanni Franco just gave this horse a perfect ride. I mean, considering that he typically breaks slowly, I thought he did everything right thereafter, saved ground, peeled out in the stretch, and just had the horse to run past Cleopatra Strike.
He did. He got a 118 for his win, which is right about which he pretty much always runs. And the surprise for me was this horse went off 7-1. We talked about this race on the forecast, and I don't want to red board, but this is where you have to adapt. Trust me, I bet plenty of losers too. But he's one where I just couldn't believe it. I think he was 3-1 on the morning line. Richard Baltas' horse going off at 7-1 that has every right to win this race really surprised me. And as you said, he got a perfect trip and he took advantage of it. So not the strongest field for a grade 2. You usually want to see in the low 120s for older horses, at least, maybe a little higher. These horses only got 118, but I mean, that's what we saw coming in. It really wasn't a true grade 2 race. So, decent effort. And I'm sure we're going to see these guys again and again. Cleopatra Strike ran his usual solid race, not spectacular, but right around that high teens, low 120s mark. And as did probably the top 4 in here. So that's generally what happens when you get a race that's weak for the class. You get a bunch finish.
Yeah, it's something I've noticed a lot since I have to focus on the odds quite a bit and how people play the races. And when a race is as kind of wide open and confusing as one like this, people just often gravitate towards the same obvious logical contender, even if that horse is maybe not as likely to win as his odds might indicate. And in this case, that was just Cleopatra Strike, who didn't have a huge edge over this field, but got bet down to 6-5 just because he did make a lot of sense and didn't have the same questions to answer that a lot of others did. But Cleopatra Strike, not exactly the most trustworthy winning type because he often picks up a minor award, and that's exactly what he did again on Saturday. Moving on to Aqueduct, they ran the Laver Dodd Stakes for the New York bred fillies and mares, going the 7 furlongs on Saturday. It's a pretty wet track at Aqueduct this past weekend, and I wonder if that's what did in the heavy favorite in this race. Pause for the cause. Also, the track on Saturday at Aqueduct didn't really seem to be playing towards speed types, and Pause for the Cause is one with a lot of speed. She was the big story of this race because she was bet down to 2-5 and just didn't show up with anything close to her best effort. The beneficiary was Cash Offer, who has just been really solid. I never really thought of her as a stakes type of runner because she's really, gotten pretty good at picking up minor checks and allowance races and winning once in a while, but she just fell into the right trip here.
Yeah, I would agree. I think Pause for the Cause, I think it was a surface issue. I mean, she's never run particularly well on an off track before. She didn't break the best, but she still made the lead fairly easily in slow time. Slow pace figure. It was only 104 for the opening quarter, something well within her scope. And when it got to the top of the stretch, it was obvious she was getting beat. She just had absolutely nothing left. So I'm going to put a line through that race personally for her because I do think it was track surface. And the rest just basically ran their race that they usually run or something close to it and were able to take advantage of a horse not handling the going.
Yeah, I feel the same way. This is not a race that I think is particularly strong moving forward. Pause for the Cause had run some really big speed figures in this division previously, but that was not the case here. So I wouldn't be looking for any of these horses outside Pause for the Cause to necessarily move on to open company in the future. On Sunday at Aqueduct, we saw Lone Rock fend off the returning High Call in an allowance race. A pretty exciting race to watch because I know High Call is a horse that a lot of people liked on the Triple Crown Trail last year because he comes with this big late run in his races. And he really got there at the end of this race and appeared to have collared Lone Rock at the 16th pole. But Lone Rock just battled back at the very end of the race. There was a little bit of jostling and hurting going on in the closing strides, but Lone Rock got his nose down on the wire first.
Yeah, I think you're being a little kind saying a little bit there. I think it was quite a bit of hurting and it made the difference. But at this point at the NYRA tracks, they allow it. So, I mean, it's just the way races are run there. It's something you have to get used to because the stewards have said time and time again, they're not going to DQ for it. I mean, they say it by their actions. So, I just wanted to talk about this race mostly because it was just a solid race for both of these two. They'd been off for a little while, particularly High Cal, who we hadn't seen since last April, and they came back. The winner got a 118 speed figure, High Cal a 117. So, any improvement on that, and these two could be right back in the graded stakes competition.
Yeah, I totally agree about the herding thing. I do think High Cal would have won this race if not for the actions of Lone Rock in the late stages. I know that there was no contact between the horses, and I know it's hard for a lot of people to wrap their head around the idea that there can still be an impact on the outcome of a race when there's no contact between the horses. It's not always a bump. It's an intimidation tactic. I mean, some people just call it race riding, but when you drift out 4 paths right before the wire and force another horse that was running straight to also drift out 4 paths when that wasn't really in their plans, that's probably going to affect how they finish. And when the margin is just inches, I mean, it was a nose in this case, I really do think that made the difference. And I would have made the disqualification, but I'm not the stewards. And I know the stewards are pretty consistent about the fact that they don't disqualify when there's no contact. So that's just the way the cookie crumbles. But Lone Rock, I don't know really where this performance came from. I know he had run well in the past, but now he's in the barn of Bill Mott. And I do think it's interesting that there was not a whole lot of pace in this race and allowed Lone Rock to be more forwardly placed towards the front end because as a younger horse, Lone Rock did have a lot of tactical speed and they sort of stopped using it and rode him from off the pace a lot in the past couple of seasons. And I think he just got pretty game on the front end here, and maybe they'd want to use those tactics again in the future. As for High Cal, I thought he ran well to be second here, and the speed figure is definitely respectable. I'm not really sure where High Cal goes from here. I'm sort of 2 minds about him. I kind of feel like he's more of a closing sprinter, and I feel like his connections want to make him more of a handicap type horse, but I think a race like the Carter might be a better goal for him.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I think High Cal is 100% best as a one-turn closing sprinter. He ran okay going around 2 turns, but sometimes that's a kiss of death, because the connections keep trying it. Like you say, his wood looks better on paper than it probably was. That was a race that featured an insane pace where he almost had to finish in the money that day. But, I am more like his Gotham. That's the kind of race he wants. And I think the Carter would be a perfect spot. He'd have to improve on this return, but, the figures he ran early as a 3-year-old show that he certainly could do it.
Yeah, and we'll stick with some returning 3-year-olds, or some rather 3-year-olds turning 4 at the fairgrounds on Saturday. This was a race that I actually missed, and I'm glad you pointed it out, as Araelius Maximus, who was previously in Chad Brown's barn, was making his first start for Steve Askerson in this allowance race on Saturday. And I was really impressed by this performance. Araelius Maximus is a horse that I know Chad Brown had always been really high on. He had trained really well, dating all the way back to the summer of his 2-year-old season. Hadn't quite shown that promise on the racetrack, but I don't know if it was the barn change or the change of tactics here, but it seems like he's finally fulfilling that potential.
Yeah, this was a good race. I recommend people watch the replay if you can. I think it's a Churchill track, so you probably have to go through your ADW to find it. But it was a visually impressive race, and he beat some pretty good horses in here, particularly in Chess Chief, the runner-up. He was a good third in the Oklahoma Derby. He had run second in an allowance race. We saw him not run particularly well, but he was in the Travers, ran second in the West Virginia Derby. So he beat this horse pretty easily. I'm not sure what caused him to be off for over a year, and his comeback didn't look particularly good for Chad Brown. But, he was in against Network Effect, who's a pretty good horse, but maybe he just wasn't cranked that day. But moving to the barn of Steve Asmussen, he's certainly one of the top trainers in the game. He's probably going to finish second to Chad Brown in the Eclipse voting. And, I just thought it was a good race. He got a 1:15 TimeformUS speed figure. The pace wasn't anything special. We have one of the early fractions coded in blue, but I really like the way this horse finished off his race. And if he can stay together, stay healthy, he's one that's got a promising future. He's lightly raced, just still a young 4-year-old. So I'm curious to see where he goes.
Yeah, I was actually kicking myself when I saw that he won. I mean, not that he paid a big price. He was 2-1 in this race, but he did have a big excuse last time at Aqueduct because that was a time when the kickback situation was really detrimental to horses trying to come from the back of the pack, especially those trying to come, between horses or through the inside, which is the kind of trip that he got last time at Aqueduct. And he didn't really have a chance to run his best race that day in his return. So he did stand to do a lot better second off the layoff. But I think the change in tactics really made the difference with this horse because, I mean, he's one that I remember watching his workouts all the way back to when he was a juvenile, and he is really aggressive in his morning training. And for whatever reason, in the afternoons, they rode him like he was some deep closer. And I think that using his tactical speed really allowed him to get more into the race and kind of just accentuate his strengths, because once they got to the top of the stretch here and Ricardo Santana set him down, he showed a really nice turn of foot to put away the speeds, and Chess Chief was building up a full head of steam to come after him, and he could just never get close, and Araelius Maximus was actually drawing away again at the end. So I like this effort a lot. He's bred to run all day, so I mean, if they stretch him out further in some stakes in the future, I don't think that's going to be a problem. I know this only got a 1:15 TimeformUS speed figure, and he's going to have to run faster in the future, but now that this horse is heading in the right direction, he could do some damage in some of these stakes over the winter.
Yeah, and he's a horse that this was a race we had labeled as a no pace situation, and the PPs made it look like that. But he clearly did take the bull by the horns here, and I'm certainly not one to knock Chad Brown. He's the great trainer, probably the best one in our game. But for a horse like this that you want to show speed on dirt, I'm not sure Steve Asmussen might not be a better choice for this kind of runner. So I'm curious to see what he does with him and how he turns out.
A lot to follow out of these races, and we'll catch up on all that in future months and weeks. As for this week, that's it for this podcast. We'll be back again on Friday with the TimeformUS forecast. I think the upcoming races this weekend, some from Santa Anita, some from Gulfstream. I believe they're running the Marshuas River on Saturday at Gulfstream, the La Cañada at Santa Anita. So we'll take a look at those races, choose some to talk about on Friday as we get back onto a normal schedule with these 2 podcasts a week. As always, you can listen to us on drf.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, or SoundCloud, wherever you get your podcast. Just subscribe to the Daily Racing Form and make sure to check out the TimeformUS Forecast and the TimeformUS Pacecast. Thanks for listening this week, guys, and we'll be back again on Friday.